As we move further in our event today, I am excited to introduce our next presenter for today, um, Mr. Michael Williams. Mike Williams serves as the Education Programs Manager for the National Humanities Center. As a former history teacher, he was twice recognized as his school's district's Teacher of the Year and the 2017 Organization of American Historians TASU National Teacher of the Year. Hope I said that correct, Mike. He was also recognized as a 2019 recipient of the K-12 Distinguished Teaching Award from the National Council for Geographic Education. He has published works in the text Family History in the Classroom and When We Were British, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Visualizing Early America, and was featured as a contributing author in Time Magazine's 25 Moments That Changed History series. He has been awarded fellowships through the West Indies Teacher Institute, UNC Duke African Diaspora Fellows Program, and Rural Teachers Global Trust, where his research connected classrooms in London, Scotland, Ghana, and Barbados. He's served in a number of capacities, including the executive boards of the National Council for History Education, UNC Chapel Hill and Duke University Area Studies Teacher Advisory Council, and the Organization of American Historians. Along with these great accolades, I'm proud to say he is from Warren County, like me, from hometown. And I've heard him speak, and he's an awesome man and contribution to our community. And I am proud, very proud to present to you all Mr. Michael Williams.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate that. I'm looking forward to this, and I'll go ahead and I'll dive right in and I'll get started. So the title of my presentation is Keeping Your Head Above Water and Making a Wave When You Can. And so this talk will evaluate the unfortunate trauma that's been experienced by African Americans from a historical, social, cultural, diasporic, and even a media lens. And so from that title, you can pretty much tell where I'm going with that, keeping your head above water, making a wave when you can. I'm a fan of music, movies, and television. I'm an active professional DJ, and so I love music. So there are going to be some references to 70s and 80s and 90s media nostalgia throughout here. So we'll keep it going. Big shout out to Cardinal Innovations. Thank you for the work that you are doing here in my home region. As well as throughout the state. But as I understand it, for 11 years, you've invested your time and resources to provide access to those who otherwise would not have the benefits, would not have the providers and the supports to address their complex health needs, and I applaud you for that. Also, I applaud public forums and programs that focus on acknowledging the combined effects of history, trauma, and these long-lasting generational effects of medical maltreatment, whether it's misdiagnosis, inadequate medical health care. But what you're doing is commendable. And in my opinion, it's a mark of courageous leadership. As I was researching, I came across a quote actually from Glenn Close, who is an actress, but also an activist for mental illness and mental health care, which stemmed from a little sister she actually had named Debbie, who suffered with mental illness throughout her entire life. But it said what mental health needs is more sunlight, more candor, more unashamed conversation. And so, in my opinion, courageous leadership requires courageous conversations. Dr. Branch mentioned that earlier today when he was talking about these critical conversations that we have to have. And some of the resources that I'm going to have here, I'll have them posted, refer to them, but they will be shared with you in the PowerPoint presentation. And I have sources included with each one because I would love for you all to be able to go into it and look at something like the courageous conversation about race. It's a compass that you use, and you have 4 different sections. You have emotionally, intellectually, morally, and socially. Everyone enters the conversation at their own place, and they shouldn't necessarily be prejudged because they're not at the place where you are right now. So here's another one of those little tidbits. So check it out when you get the opportunity. Emotional, intellectually, morally, socially. Who am I? I work for an organization called the National Humanities Center, and I know a lot of medical professionals are here today, but I will let you know that we have resources that are available, particularly as it directly relates to a lot of the topics that I will cover here today. But really quickly, we're located in Research Triangle Park, just outside of Durham. For 42 years, we've supported the best in humanities scholarship and humanities education. Every year, we host 40 plus university professors and scholars who come to our center, engage in their research, write books, et cetera, et cetera. We're proud to say Dr. Henry Louis Gates is one of our former fellows, also Rita Dove as well. But as with a lot of institutions, a lot of our work right now is done remotely. And so right now we're all working from home. I'm working from home right now as I sit in my bedroom, and my 8-year-old runs throughout the house. So if you hear me at some point say, hey, sit your butt down. Yeah, that's my 8-year-old. That's my boy. So my session goals for today are as follows. I love studying history, and I love the idea of cultural awareness. And as medical professionals and practitioners, I think this is something that is integral to everything that everyone is doing and what we're doing in whole. And so I hope to promote that cultural awareness by digging deep, by going back to look at a lot of the historical underpinnings that have effect on things that we're dealing with today. So we'll talk about that. But when I talk about cultural awareness or cultural competence, I talk about maybe 4 different dimensions. The idea we're going to have awareness, and that's you being conscious of your own personal reactions to people who are different. And we all deal with that. But then also an attitude, how we carefully examine our own beliefs and values about cultural differences. You frequently hear people say, oh, well, I am colorblind. I don't see color. However, the encouraging viewpoint is maybe you should see it such that you can appreciate that different cultural view. And so people have it when they go internationally, when they visit different countries around the world, they appreciate it. But in our backyard, there are people who have different cultural practices and ideas who are different from us. And so sometimes we have to check our own attitude. And what I'm really driving today is this whole idea of knowledge, this experience, and growing that wealth of knowledge of different cultural practices. And so we'll do that. And then later on, you'll develop those skills when you routinely do these things by focusing on practicing cultural competence and awareness. Because the reality is you're not going to get it right. No one's going to get it right. I'm not going to get it right. Every day I'm trying, but the effort is what's key. Putting in the effort to understand instead of putting up walls. All right. Engaging in those cultural critical and courageous conversations. So promote cultural awareness, understand the transatlantic origins, and present the reality of Black trauma. Dr. Branch did an awesome job of digging into that today and kind of unpacking, what actually triggered this within us, our own experiences. But then also we're going to celebrate the resiliency of mental and medical health professionals who have committed their lives to those in need, who have committed their lives to people who face and who deal with all kinds of complex medical issues and disorders, okay? Roadmap. So we have our goals, and here's how it's going to be structured. So first, you're going to hear me talk about the Evans Get Involved. I'm originally from Drury and Manson. If you got relatives in Drury and Manson, I'm not talking about those Evans, but I'm talking about the Evans who are going to get involved. And this is contextualizing representations of Black mental health, trauma, and coping. Like, what are the representations daily? What do we see? All right. What are the ideas that are, frequently given as to Black trauma, and what does it look like in and outside of the community? I'll also talk about roots deep, rivers wide, and how we're going to use historical perspective to promote this cultural competence, this cultural awareness. And then trending the rough, surviving the storm. We're going to examine, in antebellum, we're talking about the Civil War, pre-Civil War area, but these medical practices and scientific racism that some of you may have actually heard about throughout your journey. Self-determination and resilience. So we're going to highlight the work of mental health professionals. And I will say that you will see throughout this presentation that I'm going to make reference to water, to bodies of water. And that's, it's symbolic. It operates metaphorically because it looks at how the importance of water as a life given, as a tool for transportation, as a tool for an element of rebirth and renewal, but one that you find throughout the Black experience. You hear it talking about crossing the River Jordan or wading in the water, things like that. So you'll see those references to it. But it, for this presentation, it's going to go back to this whole transatlantic slave trade, piece. Okay. Evans get involved. So earlier today, I really enjoyed listening to Dr. Branch. When he asked the question, he said, all right, tell me about moments where you experienced trauma. And he must have read my mind. He hit the nail on the head. Dr. Branch, if you're listening, you hit the nail on the head with that, because well before I knew about this, I started thinking about, all right, when did I encounter a trauma as a child? And I can name a number of instances. I can name instances that happened within the last year. But as a child, there were a few series of events where I was introduced to a Black family who lived in an inner city area, high poverty, dealt with socioeconomic strife daily, political inequality, lived in a marginalized community. This is the family I'm talking about. Deborah, you said it earlier. In fact, I am talking about Good Times. And what particularly I'm talking about with Good Times, I'm talking about a particular episode of Good Times. All right, Carmen, a Chicago baby. And for those who do not know, when you look at the Good Times back in the day, the Cabrini Green housing development, housing projects, however you want to describe it, was where this was situated. But there was a particular episode for me that really stood out. And even to this day, when I think about trauma and things I experienced as a child, this really stood out to me. People in the chat, you know the episode I'm talking about. It was episode 86 that aired in 1977. That episode was called Evans Get Involved. And there were a lot of lows in this series, and these highs and lows were throughout, and that's one other thing I'm going to talk about. But it aired in 77. This was 3 years after it began. It wasn't the episode where James died, but it was the episode where we met Penny Gordon. For those who don't know, Penny was abused by her mother. She was a child who followed JJ home, had all these fabrications about this wonderful place that she lived there, and how happy her family life was. But the end of the episode, towards the end, it was a 2-part episode, but by implication, you hear of Penny getting burned with an iron. And to be honest with you, to this day, I can remember her exclaiming, "Mama, no. Mama, no." And as a child growing up, that really, really hit me. It was one of those things that resonated with me even to this day. And the mother, who's Chip Fields, who was played by Kim Fields' mother, did an awesome job in this role. But as a child, and even to this day, our children are experiencing these things. Dr. Branch, of course, mentioned this earlier, but throughout my journey, I can think about instances where life has imitated art far more than art imitating life, or vice versa, however you want to look at it. But I remember specific experiences as to representations of Black trauma where, say, for instance, is it life or art when you were watching the Bicycle Man episode with Different Strokes, with what happened with Dudley and the bicycle store owner, or for guys like me who grew up in a home without a father, the episode of Papa's Got a Brand New Excuse of Fresh Prince, where Will Smith he said, why don't he want me? Why don't he want me? Or the episode of Living Single, High Anxiety, where Khadijah, who was very, very strong, who represent the strength and independence of Black women, she breaks down as she has to come to terms with her depression and her anxiety. Or maybe on another scale, when we look at the show or look at the movie, I was going to say Crooklyn, Jungle Fever. But in movies like that, where Samuel Jackson and Halle Berry played Gator and Vivian, and this drove home the detrimental effects of drug addiction on both the users, but also their families. Or Everyone remembers this. You remember when Ricky was shot in Boys in the Hood? When Ricky died, John Singleton's tragic coming-of-age story. When an up-and-coming college-bound football player, Ricky, was gunned down by a gang. For those, all 138 of us, who remembers instances like that. Young lives lost. So even for those of us who are 90s kids who were in college during that time where we woke up and heard that Tupac had been shot again, but I mean that he had gotten shot and he died, or Left Eye, or Aaliyah, or when Biggie passed away in 97, all types of trauma that we're experiencing. Now, keep in mind, this is removed from our house, but because we live in these immersive media-driven environments, we were dealing with it. But has it changed? The kids are dealing with it today, representations of trauma, and it all goes back to central locations and places. One of the quotes I like is that processing and dealing with layers of individual trauma on top of new mass traumas from COVID-19, uncertainty, isolation, grief from financial or human loss, police brutality, and its fetishization in news media and divisive political rhetoric adds compounding layers of complexity for individuals to responsibly manage. You know, when we grew up, the TV went off. Anybody remember that in the chat? Y'all remember when the TV would go off? And you would see like the plane flying, TV would go off. That meant you've been up too late already. But today we have a 24-hour news cycle. We have social media. We have constant bombarding and feedback as to who we are. And we deal with the experiences, and our kids are dealing with those experiences as well. Amanda Gorman, shining star, young, first youth poet laureate, said, when a day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea. Again, back to water, a sea we must wade. Roots deep, river wide. We're going to use historical perspective to promote cultural competence. And so there'll be some deep dives where I'll share some personal experiences. I'll share some academic material, some primary source material that we'll be able to look at when we talk about this idea of roots deep and rivers wide. Roots deep, rivers wide. Let's go. That's an image of a place called Cape Coast Castle, Ghana. Years 2016, I'm standing there. I've been researching that place for months. By the grace of God and a fellowship from the Rural Trust, I was able to go over there and actually witness that place. I was able to stand in that place. When I got back, you know, I did a lot of reading that actually forms the foundation of this, but one of my quotes from Tommy Persichilli said, understanding the past enables new ways of addressing current implications and identify barriers. So we have two different approaches. We can remember the past, but we can also understand the past. The past, truly understanding the past is understanding the historical perspective, the historical context of the things that happened. And so we'll go back. We've all heard of enslavement and the things that happens, the horrendous 3 to 6 month journey across the Atlantic, all of those things. And so when we look at it in terms of the roots of Black trauma, a lot of things we're better able to understand. Let's talk about Black history, because it's important. I said I was going to talk about Black History Month. Okay. This gentleman's name is Dr. Carter G. Woodson. He was born in New Canton, Virginia. If y'all got in your car and you went up 85 and crossing the South Hill, and I think there's a left you make on 1 or 15, something like that, it'll take you to New Canton, be about 2.5, 3 hours. But he was born there. He was born 10 years after the Civil War in 1875. Again, we were doing this cultural awareness. Let's talk Black history and Black History Month. His parents were named Ann Eliza and James Henry. His parents were illiterate. What I find most striking about him is he was unable to attend high school until he was 20, but he finished in 2 years. The other interesting part is he came back to school 3 years later and became the principal of the school. Won't he do it? So, but he launched Negro History Week in 1926 and 1976. That will become the Black History Month celebration that we celebrate today. If you go to New Canton, you also see a marker there as well with them. And I see one of my fraternity brothers, the good Dr. Putney here, who we all know and we celebrate the fact that he is a member of my fraternity, the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. We got to keep going into this historical perspective. And so, for some of you all, I see you, Katrina. Katrina said, yes, it will. There are people who even today ask the question, why do we need a Black History Month? And I can tell you, I can talk for 2 hours on that, but just understand that you have neglect, but you also have the intentional erasure of certain information throughout our experience. And that, our history is largely relegated to the month of February, which I used to have an issue with, because I would always say, well, why we got to have the shortest month out of the year? Why can't we have it in, July when we have some Black History Month cookouts or something like that? But the reality is that Dr. Woodson envisioned that we would have this month during the month of President Lincoln's birthday, but then also the same month of Frederick Douglass, the famed abolitionist, the same month of his birthday or his assumed birthday. But let's face it, but we can't, if we're in a gallery, we can't change the course of history by turning the faces of portraits to the wall. This is important to understanding or engaging in these courageous conversations. We have to have them. We have to have the critical conversations that date back to events like this. I invite you to take a look at this, and I hope the full screen is sharing. If it's not, then I can change it. Dr. Putney, will you let me know, can you see the date at the top of that? If not, I think I have to expand the screen. But I'm going to play this, and I want you to pay attention. And if you can't see it, I will say that it, yep, 1731. Okay, good. Take a look at this, and I'll give you all this as a chat. But when we're talking about the impact of Black trauma, this starts in 1527, I want to say. But to the right is the Horn of Africa. And what you see, the little dots, you see ships that beginning in the year 1500s. Well, we frequently hear about the year 1619. We frequently hear about that, but there was an active world trade, sugar trade of Africans that existed well before then, for at least 100 years. And the large majority of those people who were taking from that area extended from places in the Gold Coast down to Angola. And so you see all the little ships that are going. I'm gonna pause and be quiet for a sec, because you're gonna see the millions of ships that are crossing the Atlantic. And also know that a typical ship could contain up to 700 Africans. Can everyone see that? Keith, I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, you can. Thank you, John. Now, you will note that the majority after about 1808, the majority of those ships went to South America. See, what's lost is that the large majority of enslaved Africans actually went to South America, but we automatically think that the slave ships came directly from Africa to the United States of America or to the Americas, when in fact, the large majority of them actually went to places like Bahia, Brazil, and places like that. And so, again, just little tidbits. If you have your notes, just write some of these things down. You'll have the links to it. But to know that millions of ships crossed the Atlantic, How many people were taken? Well, if you look at the bottom right totals, there were 12,500,000 people who were actually taken during that time. Okay, remember that number. How many arrived? Actually, 10 million. So along the way, there were 2 million people who perished. So we're talking about Black trauma. There were 2 million people who actually perished, who never made it. 300,000 were destined for the United States or destined for America. Only 252,000 actually made it. Interestingly enough, I point out where the green section is. It dropped from 89,000 in 1801 to 1,600 in 1826. Why? Because in 1807, the international trade of slaves was banned. And so anybody who was doing it then were actually transporting contraband to these areas. And so that's one of the things that that gets lost in the shuffle when people are talking about the slave trade. Now, keep in mind, there were slave ships. There was actually the slave ship Catilda that made its way to the southern Mississippi, Alabama, and you can find that online as well. Vern, that's a great question. What about the numbers that went to Asia and India as well? And the information I have is from slavevoyages.org. When I researched in London in 2015, I came across a lot of this information. And interestingly enough, there's not a lot of data or a lot of information in the ship logs. And what I will say is this for you all, and I'll put it in the chat, if you get the opportunity, check out slavevoyages.org. It's in the chat, but you can check out that. And slavevoyages.org will give you a lot of information about that. Again, origins of this trauma that we talk about. Okay. Also, just to drive home, the Royal African Company, there were several others that were engaged in this trade of slaves, but this book is actually a photo I took of a slave log. And the reason why I'm showing you this is that a slave ship captain named Peter Blake, he commanded a ship, and on that ship, he kept detailed accounts of what was happening on his ship, just like anybody would, any person who was merchant who would trade in goods would. But one thing I found particularly striking, and is really hard to kind of read this, but they have a mortality table in that book. And in the mortality table, as I read through it, I came across one notation, and I'll read it out, but it says, the one received from Neomba dies of flux. The other received ditto, who leaped overboard and drowned himself. So you have an instance of suicide, which was happening on a slave ship. And we've heard about these instances in popular culture. Everyone remembers Killmonger when he makes the speech at the end of Black Panther, and he says, bury me, in the sea graves with my ancestors. A reference to the fact that there were Africans who said, I will not be allowed to become a slave or taken into this unknown. And so they dove them into a watery grave. That degree of trauma, which was happening in 1765. Another account can be found in a book called The Zong. In the book, The Zong, this author named James Welvin, he detailed this traumatic event which happened in 1781, where 130 Africans were thrown overboard to collect insurance proceeds. In the same way that people commit insurance fraud today, this happened in 1781. So what happened was they ran out of water, and they didn't have enough water, and they wanted to transact and sell able-bodied enslaved people, and they realized that this would be a problem. So instead of figuring out something, they threw them overboard and were later charged as a result of it. But these roots of this trauma, but there are people who are going to be around you who are all going to say the same thing. But listen, it was so long ago, Mike. It was so long ago. Get over it. I mean, what? It was so long ago, but was it so long? A. Burris, you're exactly right. Epigenetics sounds like another version of generation trauma, epigenetics. But it was so long ago. What do you mean it was so long ago? If we look at the spectrum of American slavery, what you were looking at started in 1526, but the 13th Amendment wasn't passed till 1865. By my math, that's 339 years where Black people were enslaved in the country. You factor in segregation and Jim Crow laws, which last from 1865 to 1954. After freedom, that was 89 years. 89 years, and then Brown versus Board of Education was passed that got rid of segregation in public schools. So now we're at 1954, where you're still not able to enjoy the freedoms, where you're still dealing with this varying levels of trauma daily. It might be threats of violence, it might be mental abuse, it might be threats to the lives of your family members. And so when we look at it and we say, well, okay, well, do the math between 54 and 2021, that's 67 years. You know, I praise God for my mother, who was born in 1953, 1 year before the passage of a law that allowed her to sit beside, and uncles and cousins to sit beside people of another race. So when we talk about it, I really want, and I'm so happy, you know, that I have you all on board who are listening, because it's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. But the reality is that 339 years versus, you know, the 100 and, well, I mean, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, 54, you can date back to 1865, but a little over 150 years or so of freedom. And so when you're engaging in these conversations, when we are focusing on this idea of cultural awareness, let's not be insensitive to it. Let's go back to that compass I showed at the beginning that talked about this idea of assessing our attitudes. Let's unpack that. All right, these insecurities. And also, Jose, I'll touch on the 13th Amendment, but you're exactly right. Okay, let's keep it going, because I have a lot to cover and I know better. What am I looking at? For those, we still here, you're right, Monet. For those who are looking at this map, I enjoy looking at it as percentage of population who are enslaved right now. So I know Cardinal Innovations, you know, serve clients throughout the state. But in our location, where we're located up here in this region, you will find that we are up here where Warren County is located. That green arrow right there is Warren County, which is where I was born. All right, you got Warren, Franklin, Granville. You also have Vance beside it as well. But one thing you will note, if you look at this chart, that Warren County, Halifax, Northampton, all those areas, and even Granville, Franklin, they all are around that 30–40%. But this area up here, just so you can understand, if we're talking about cultural awareness, understand the population that you serve this from, a community or an area that was traditionally housed as one of the areas that had the most plantations, the most enslaved Black people in this state. And so when we look at trends with educational funding, as well as resources available, a lot of things that go to overcoming the poverty line, let's look at these things. Let's be aware. Let's consider these things. And this is just an update to it. I want to say this was from 2014, but if you look at the percentages, Northeast region of North Carolina, as well as down in Charlotte, places like that, these are those regions. So let's be mindful of these things when we're looking at it. So that's just kind of getting into the foundations. Again, I can go into a lot more, descriptions or discussions. And actually, I paused just now because I'm trying to read the quote. Annabelle, I saw your quote as well. But I was trying to read, and my wife gets on me because she said, you can't do two things at one time. So y'all don't tell her I did that, because I told her I can. Treading the rough, surviving the storm, another analogy that directly relates to this idea of water transport. But let's examine antebellum medical practices and what was known as scientific racism. Historical adversity. All right, what is that, and what were the measures to overcome? And I want to give a shout out because I've found sources in different locations that actually relate to this, that discuss it. Cardinal Innovations, big shout out to you for your information on Black History Month resources. If I can give you a virtual high five, I give you a virtual high five right now. But what is, and I refer to this because I believe there's a reference to this on your site as well, but what does that include? It includes transatlantic bondage, which we've discussed. It includes slavery. It includes segregation, exclusion from health, social, and economic resources, all those things. And so I point to this particular image right here from Barbados. And in Barbados, they had this place that was particularly traumatic for enslaved people. And so back then, they had this area in Barbados known as the Cage. It's located in Bridgetown, but they have a plaque in the middle of town that's called the Cage, where runaway slaves were kept until their owners came to reclaim them. The enclosure established by an act of parliament in 1688. It was originally located in the center of town, but they moved it out to the outskirts. The reason why? The town's image was so concerning to them, such that the noise and the stench of the slaves who were kept there was so bad that they had to remove the quote unquote cage from the center of town. So you had that things like that which were occurring. All right. Also, if we jump ahead, and I'll jump around a little bit, I'm going to go to emancipation, because now we're going to get into this idea of medical racism, mistreatment, scientific misdiagnosis as well. So emancipation was January 1, 1863. I'm also going to be pulling from resources that are locally based for those who are in Northeastern North Carolina. For example, you all have probably seen these before. This runaway slave advertisement. All right. And you can find this, and interesting enough, a partnership between UNCG and North Carolina A&T came together to create this virtual library where you can pull up all these North Carolina slave advertisements, and you can actually pull them up from anywhere, obviously, but you can actually center on your particular community or town. So you can type in like, Roanoke Rapids, or you can type in Lincolnton, or you can wherever else, and find out runaway ads from that time. The one that I'm looking at right now is from Henderson. All right. And the date of this is April 17th, 1863. Now, keep in mind, January 1, 1863 is when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln. And the Library of Congress has a lot of this information as well. But he signed this after the Battle of Antietam, which is located in Maryland. But he signed this after that hard, bloody battle. And the goal was to free slave and enslaved people in all states that are at war with the Union. Basically, he said, if you're in the South and you're enslaved, you're going to be freed. Obviously, the Confederacy was still fighting the Civil War. They didn't listen to it. Fighting continued on. People remained enslaved. But interesting enough, there were enslaved people who found out, who were aware of what was happening, and some of them walked away. I point to this runaway ad that was in in Henderson, North Carolina, and this has a connection to medical misdiagnosis and scientific racism, all those things, and I'll explain it here shortly. But because it was Henderson, I want to talk about it. But in the ad, what it says is, ran away from the neighborhood of Henderson, North Carolina in the month of July last. Negro boy Solomon, 20 years of age, 5 feet 2 or 3 inches high, quite black, small head and face, prominent eyes, and quick of speech. He is supposed to have passed himself for a free boy and gone off as a servant for some soldier, and is probably in camp. Said boy belongs to the estate of Major T.L. Skinner, deceased, and the subscriber will pay the above named reward for his apprehension and delivery, or for his confinement in jail. Eliza Skinner, who was the executrix. April 17th, 1863. This was signed and ran in the paper in Oxford. The image that you see here is one of the popular depictions that you would see in any slave ad. All right. Now, why am I talking about Henderson, and why am I talking about enslaved ads and things like that? Well, the reason why is that there was a disease called drapetomania. There was a doctor. His name was Samuel Cartwright. Samuel Cartwright was a medical doctor who came up. He was a pro-slavery physician in Louisiana. He came up with the disease of Black people to assess the mental health of Black people. And here's what it is. It's a disease of the mind that causes the enslaved to want to run away. Runaway slave disorder is what it's called. I'm gonna let y'all marinate on that. So the act of wanting freedom was called drapetomania. It was the fact that if you were enslaved and you ran away, the idea was that you were out of your mind. And the way that he felt you cured it was to severely whip enslaved people. Now, we're talking about origins of trauma. We talked about the historical perspective, but that, along with another one called diesthesia atypia, I think I pronounced that right. But they said that caused a state of dullness and lethargy among enslaved people, which years later people realized that that was depression. So pseudoscience, conjectural medicine, and scientific racism, not very long ago, but these are the underpinnings. And so when people wonder about this sense of distrust that many in the African American community have today, it has roots and verifiable roots that conversations via oral histories have been passed down for these things. For example, you had Benjamin Rush, who was known as the modern day father of psychiatry. His image is still located on the American Psychiatric Association seal, 1844. But he said that when I told you about that Negroes suffer from negritude, a mild form of leprosy, and his idea to remedy that was not so much whipping, it was if they were to become white, then it would go away. Blacks are immune to mental illness. John Galt, who ran the Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1848, he said the same thing. He said they're immune for mental illness. Why? Because they're only property. They're engaged in involuntary servitude. They don't have the worries of the world, the things that we have to think about that requires higher level of thought. And so they're immune to mental illness. These are not just snake oil salesmen or bootleg physicians, whoever else, but these are physicians who have been heralded, who have statues and things like that commemorate the things that they've done. T.O. Powell, superintendent of the Georgia Lunatic Asylum, said freedom led to increased rates of consumption and insanity. There was a study that was done, and he said in the 1840 census, they found that people who were enslaved didn't have any of these problems. But when they became free, then all of a sudden you had all of these problems that were occurring. Keep in mind, 1895. Why am I talking about that year? Because our ancestors who were in North Carolina may have saw this running in newspapers. 1895. What happened in 1895? Some people call it the Wilmington coup. All right. Some people use the term the Wilmington massacre or the Wilmington race riots. Was a series of events that happened to dispossess the Black community of Wilmington. Wilmington had large numbers of Black people who held positions of power. But in 1898, an act of terrorism that was politically motivated and designed to deprive these Black leadership of their power was held. But keep in mind, y'all, this is not what would cause depression or mental illness. It's the fact that they're now free, not the threats to their lives and their very existence. What makes matters worse, when you all look this up and study the Wilmington coup or riot, or I call it act of terrorism. Hey, that's a word. I guess we can have a whole other discussion on that one as well. But what makes matters worse was a former Confederate general was appointed as the police chief during this time. So along with segregation, while their homes were being destroyed, you had state-sanctioned violence, which was actually happening because sheriff's deputies were going down there. There's one account of a deputy dragging a Black woman down the street by her hair, for several blocks. So you had all these things that are happening, but medical professionals are saying that, no, this is not what's happening. What's happening is all of this stems from the fact that you are now free. Moving ahead a little bit further into the 1900s, into the 20th century. And if you have questions or anything, please put them in the chat box. I can go and I'll keep on talking and all of these things. Jonathan is exactly right. It makes me wonder how we keep from going under. That's right. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. You talked to the right one, buddy. I love those hip hop references, but you're exactly right. Is how do we go through this, wade through this sea of despair? But you hold fast and you stay strong, all of these things. Okay. Let's talk about the North Carolina eugenics program. Some of you all may have heard of the eugenics program, which was initiated here in North Carolina. But at the turn of this century, a lot of these practices remain the same. In North Carolina, the poor, the people who are marginalized, mentally handicapped, they face sterilizations. North Carolina was one of the country's largest and most aggressive eugenics programs. And back, I want to say during Mike Easley's administration, it was brought to the attention of, the government obviously knew about it, but there was this fierce advocacy from newspaper reporters from out of Winston-Salem. They were investigative journalists, and they found some of the people who had this forced sterilization who was done to them. And as the program went on, like it was, there were white people, black people, all who were, but as the program moved into the 60s, the victims became increasingly poor and increasingly black. So there's a book right there called Against Their Will, which details a lot of these things that was happening as well. And so again, I can share personal stories right now, and we're all having these conversations with relatives who are like, yeah, I know it's a vaccine, but I don't know if I'm going to take it, man. I don't know. We have relatives who are saying this, and as mental health professionals, these are things that I'm sure you confront. And I'm just an academic. I'm just like a historian, a little book nerd. You know what I mean? Like, but in your space, these are conversations I'm sure you have, but you never know who had a relative who might have lived in one of these counties. So if you look up here, Warren County, the percentage of sterilizations performed by county, this is from the Eugenics Board. You see, find your particular state here. And your particular state or your particular county, and put it in the chat box. All right. If I'm from Warren County, I live in Franklin County now. All right. Sterilization performed per county, 64 in Franklin County, 44 Warren. All right. So Mecklenburg County, the only red area in the state, 485 sterilizations. These are people whose lineage was cut short, whose ability to produce and recreate themselves because the state actors considered them to be subnormal, and they passed that judgment against them. And so one other level. So again, this historical perspective, what we're looking at the trauma that is born, of the Black experience. Yolanda said Caswell. All right, Shanquella said Tuscaloosa, Montgomery, Alabama, Sampson County, Forsyth County, Guilford County, all of these places like that. So it came up, and actually there was a commission that was appointed. There's a PDF that's located online if you want to look at additional information about it, but it delves into it and really has a frank discussion about what happened. And I want to say the victims did receive compensation following this, but can you ever remedy that? Is that something that could be remedied? Let's talk about the Haldol ad. There was something called protest psychosis. Protest psychosis. Here's what it meant. Now, for those of you who does, so in my work, I enjoy doing this thing called visual thinking strategies, VST. And visual thinking strategy is just an approach to looking at a primary source document and unpacking it. So in the chat box, if you all see, look at the page on the left, don't necessarily focus on the Haldol, the language. What's the first thing? If you were to look away and then look back at the screen, what's the first thing that you see when you look at that ad? Again, everything under assaultive and belligerent. What do you see? And I'll help along the way. Well, the first thing I see red. Annabelle said it looks devilish. Okay, so it looks devilish. Okay, what else? An angry Donna, you're exactly right. One of the articles that I read about this, they said it looks like an angry James Brown. All right, angry. Can you make out ethnicity by his features? Pain, lots of anger. The fist Shanita, you're exactly right. The fish, the madman, the mad black man. So keep in mind what is going on during the 1960s. You have a period of advocacy that's happening in the United States of America where the civil rights movement was moving along. You had protests that were all over the country. So Haldol was actually a drug that was distributed in the late 1960s. It was during the height of the civil rights movement. Interestingly enough, when it was first released in the 1950s, say for instance 1957, it was released as kind of like an antidepressant. Like it was marketed to suburban housewives, and it was a mild approach to it. But then all of a sudden, during the 60s, this ad of an angry African-American man shaking his fists. He's wearing street clothes, and he has this ruffled shirt, wide collar, and you see an urban scene in the background with fires flaming. He's sneering. All right. His features are distorted. So the idea is to paint this threatening image of this man. Okay. But this is blatantly discriminatory imagery, and it's designed to actually promote an agenda that Black men, that Black people who are protesting suffer from schizophrenia, and that if you want to calm them down, you have to prescribe them Haldol. Haldol will help with these protests. It has nothing to do with systemic racism or patterns of segregation or all the things that we were talking about before. It's now a psychosis. All right. It's now schizophrenia. And from what I understand, it was during that time that violent and hostile became part of the description of schizophrenia. Before then, it was, focused on mildness and all this other stuff. But and there are a host of articles that talk about the numbers of Black men then and throughout history who were written off as being schizophrenic and as well. Okay, so that's the Haldol ad, assaultive and belligerent, and then it also has cooperation begins with Haldol. All right. The problematic Haldol ad was emerged from a culture moment in which concerns about race, insanity, and Black political protest lodged into mainstream anxieties, social network, and notions of common sense. Talk about incarceration and mental illness. Jose earlier talked about the 13th Amendment, and I referred to the 13th Amendment. And interesting enough, for those, so I used to ask this question a lot, and some of them may not know. Some people talk about the fact about the 13th Amendment, which was ratified December 6, 1865. Well, the Emancipation Proclamation was 1863. So honestly, and this is a question if your kids ask, you can pass this on to them, but people ask, well, why do you need a 13th Amendment if you had an Emancipation Proclamation? Well, Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln's order only applied to states at war with the Union. So basically it was applied to the South, and the idea was to punish the South, during the Civil War. And so in December of 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed. And so it was passed to nationalize freedom. Okay, it was a part of a series of amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, called the Civil War Amendments. 13th was freedom, 14th was equality and due process, and then the 15th Amendment ended up being the voting. But in the 13th Amendment, and this is the part that the Netflix documentary was based on, but it says neither slavery, so they're banning slavery here in the country, but neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof of the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other places. Deborah, I'm sorry I didn't catch your response. Monet, you're exactly right. The year was 1974 that ad actually came out. That one was published. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. Here's the kicker. Here's the important part that's kind of missed when we talk about that. There was something called a convict leasing program, which kind of paved the way for rise of mass incarceration. And just again, I'm keeping this within the mental health framework because I'll give you the end point that I'm going to go to the fact that The majority of mental health, a lot of the mental health that's done in our country today, particularly as it relates to African Americans, happens behind the walls of prisons. And I may have not worded that correctly, but I'll show you the stat here. But what I'm starting with is the origins of it, the origins of these things. For example, Ida B. Wells, who famous civil rights pioneer, and who advocated against lynching. She spoke in 1893 at this called the World's Columbian Exposition. And in it, she talked, and I'll tell you all, I typically don't like putting a lot of words on slideshows. I don't like that death by PowerPoint thing, but I wanted to kind of drive home this because it has so much good information. But it said the convict lease system and lynch law are twin infamous which flourish hand in hand. So we got twin infamous. We got convict leasing, which is renting out enslaved people, but then you got lynch laws. And they flourish hand in hand in many of the United States. They are two of the great outgrowths and results of the class legislation under which our people suffer. Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Nebraska, and North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Washington claim to be too poor to maintain state convicts within prison walls. Hence, the convicts are leased out to work for railway contractors, mining companies, and those who farm large plantations. Keep on down to the bottom. It says 9/10 of these convicts are Negroes. Two images I'm showing you. One is from Asheville, North Carolina, Memorial Public Library. It was a postcard called Stripes, but No Stars, showing a convict leasing crew that worked on railroads out in eastern North Carolina. Another one that's even more disheartening was the image of young boys. I want to say this was in a place called Sugarland, Texas. These kids are like 10 years old. They're working on a convict leasing program. Why did this happen? There's several factors. Again, it's Black history. Let's understand what was happening at this time. It's historical contextualization. So the 13th Amendment allowed for involuntary servitude, right? So basically, if you're free unless you get locked up. If you get locked up, then you can be forced to work in slave conditions. That's basically what it says. What was going on at the end of the Civil War? What's the best way to say this? The South was broke. I mean, you know how you ask somebody, man, let me spot me $20. And they say I'm broke. The South was broke. All right. During that time, Black codes were enacted, which meant restrictions on voting. So think about this. Before the end of the Civil War, you had slave codes where slaves couldn't go out a certain time, couldn't do things, couldn't own a weapon, couldn't read. Well, after the Civil War, you had Black codes that were created. And the Black codes basically said you couldn't go places, you had to have a curfew. Some of the codes were attitudinal, meaning if you showed disrespect. So if you did those things, you could be what? Arrested. And you living in a place that faced what's called fiscal insolvency. The South lost a lot of money because you think about it, their primary machine for making money had been freed after the Civil War. What are they going to look to? Convict leasing. So former plantation owners would get formerly enslaved, quote unquote, convicts who would work on railroads, chain gangs, all of these things, all of these areas. I say all those things because the reality is that, and I mentioned this earlier, but jails are the largest providers of mental health services across the country. All right. And I have the rest of that quote. What did my rest of my quote go? All right. In states, a jail or prison holds more mentally ill individuals than the largest remaining state psychiatric hospital. In a 2017 report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they noted that 44%, that 44 keeps popping up, of jail inmates and 37% of prisoners have previously been told by a mental health professional that they had a mental health disorder. Individuals with psychiatric diseases like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are 10 times more likely to be in jail or prison than a hospital bed. And that's from the State Justice Initiative. It was April of last year, and there's an article entitled Improving the Justice System, a Response to Mental Illness, a fact sheet. And that fact sheet, I barely scraped the, scratched the surface with the amount of information that they actually have about mental illness and criminalization. This image here really stood out to me because when we talk about trauma, whether we witness it, there are a lot of people, particularly who were raised in poverty. I was raised in poverty. I had images that I saw quite frequently. But I thought about, and I came across an account from a licensed graduate professional counselor named James Rose. And this pretty much sums up, and it's heartbreaking and jarring at the same time. But the fact that men like this are locked away. To the police, he was a drunken man on a park bench. To me, he revealed a life of trauma and tragedy that was the underlying cause for his behavior. That is our work as counselors, to help people understand the dark forces that drive them to behaviors that they know are harmful to themselves. And so earlier this morning, I was sitting here and I was so amped. I had to get up, amped, meaning hype. I had to get out of my chair when Dr. Branch was talking, because it was an honest, courageous talk where he delved into these forces that drive many in our community to these behaviors that we don't know are harmful to ourselves. And so as we were looking at it, we're like, hold on, did he say something about church? Hold on, hold on, player. Stay in the book. You know what I mean? You don't know me. You don't know. You know what I mean? Like that, it was like that kind of approach to it. But the reality is that in many ways we have things that we have to unpack. And before anybody else asks too, I'm a Christian as well. But I think there are learned behaviors that we have to unpack as it relates to our relationships with other people in our community, as it relates to understanding and reconciling history, all of these things. Okay. All right, experimentation and medical racism. What do I mean? I'm going to give you these, and I'm not going to delve into it because in the interest of time, I will just say the names. They'll be in the PowerPoint. But J. Marion Sims, who's known as the father of modern gynecology, and this is his statue being removed and taken away in New York over protests within the last year or so. But he is the man who is known for experimenting on enslaved women, who placing them through excruciating pain that I can hardly adequately describe, but he was known as the father of gynecology. You also have the Tuskegee experiment, who's known as the famous syphilis study. Keep in mind, this wasn't too long. It was 1932. That was several generations ago. But for those who don't know, the Tuskegee experiment, or known as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, it started in 1932, when there was a time that they didn't really have a treatment or a cure for syphilis. And so after being recruited, you had 600 Black men in Macon, I think Macon County, Alabama, but they were enrolled in a project. And that project was that they would receive free medical care. They just had to come and get a shot. So they showed up to get the shot. Well, in effect, what was happening is they were actually injecting the men who were primarily, most of them were sharecroppers, and many of them had never even gone to a doctor before. Keep in mind, 1932. But they injected about close to 400 men with syphilis. And then they had a control group of another maybe 200 or so. And they told them that, they were being treated for bad blood and all that time. So years later, they found out that 28 of those men died from it. 100 more of them, they didn't know they were carrying it. 100 more passed away from complications from that. So we wonder about this distrust. As you become aware of these things, as you become knowledgeable of them, again, it's Friday afternoon, TGIF, just pack it away, make a note of it, email me if you have more questions about the resources, things like that. You also have the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which HBO did a movie about some years ago. But Henrietta Lacks, she was a Black woman. She's there with a husband, but she was treated unsuccessfully for cervical cancer in 1951. But they removed the tumor, but doctors kept a sample of that tissue, and that tissue is called, I can't remember the specific medical, like it's H something, something, something. But her cells provided a breakthrough that would prove totally invaluable to the entire medical community, and it has been used for years from 1951, the discoveries that they made from her tissue. All right. And the goal again was to treat cervical cancer, but she didn't know about it. Her family never were told about it. And as such, they could not consent to it. So another one of these questions and these stories that form the foundation of us wondering, well, why is this distrust among the clients? Just come on in. Well, sometimes there are underpinnings and foundations to it. All right, this last section I'll get to, and then we'll get out of here. But self-determination and resilience. All right, how did our community and allies respond to the pressing need for health and wellness resources? Go through these. All right. So in 1915, Booker T. Washington actually created National Negro Health Week in 1955. In 1914, he came up with it, but in 1914, he stated, without health and until we reduce the high death rate, it'll be impossible for us to have permanent success in business and property getting. He was really kind of honing in on that. So they created at that time, even before Negro History Week was created, they created National Negro Health Week, which is celebrated in April, and his birthday is April 2nd, so that's the reason why they did it there. But he said the future of race depends on the conservation of its health. Who are early pioneers? James McCoon Smith, who's from New York, he actually graduated from medical school in Scotland, but he became one of the first African-American physicians in the United States to practice medicine. 1837. You also have Dr. Platt H. Skinner. Skinner was in New York near Niagara Falls, and before the Civil War, he actually took in a group of blind and deaf, or even both, African-American children, colored children, as the term that they would use. But he created a school for them during that time. And one of the issues he ran into severe funding problems trying to fund that as well. In North Carolina, later known as Cherry Hospital, but they created in 1867 the North Carolina School for the Blind, but then in 1869, 2 years later, they created a colored school. And in 1960s, the two would merge together to create one. But these are all measures to actually address a lot of the problems that we were talking about. Jubilee Hospital, if you're in the chat, if anybody knows where Jubilee Hospital is, the Gila Cell, Katrina, thanks for giving me that shout out. I jumped off the chat, but yes, it's the Gila Cell for Henrietta Lacks. Anybody ever heard of Jubilee Hospital? Vance County folks, Jubilee Hospital, and this is actually located in Henderson. Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so Jubilee Hospital was actually created in 1911. It ran until 1966. It was an outgrowth, they say it was an outgrowth of the Henderson Institute, which is a school that was created for Black children. But Reverend John Adam Cotton, there was an incident where there was a child who died in Henderson because they couldn't be admitted to the Henderson Hospital. And as a result of it, the family would have to basically go by wagon all the way to Durham. Reverend Cotton saw when that happened. And once it happened, he decided to donate land to build this place known as Jubilee Hospital. And it was built in 1911. They call it Jubilee because it was the year of Jubilee after the, I want to say, start of the Civil War. 51 years or so? I might be off a little bit, but it was the Jubilee year. But it was a general community hospital, 1911 to 1966. Surgical, medical, maternity, gynecological, orthopedic services, tuberculosis services. They also had a chaplain in there. They would regularly address the spiritual and mental needs of African Americans who were in Vance County. The doctors included Dr. Samuel Beckford, who Beckford Medical Center is known for and Beckford Drive is known for. But then also Dr. James P. Green Sr., who passed away, I want to say in 2006, also a member of our fraternity. But Dr. Green, out of all the people who were in there, I'm pretty sure a lot of you all remember the work of Dr. Green. But he was the chief of staff of Jubilee Hospital for some years in Vance County. Through Jubilee, wounds and bruises are bound up, the suffering are relieved, the sick healed, and the poor and needy helped. Reverend John Cotton. Right up the street in Vance County, you had the Central Orphanage of North Carolina, which was created during that time. And the Central Orphanage of North Carolina, you'll see it was founded in 1883. It was called the Grant Colored Asylum initially, but it was chartered to be a non-denominational institution. And it's still in operation today, but it's another one of those areas that came up and it was designed to address the needs of our little ones. But it provides vocational training, also religious, moral, and industrial training as well. Information about that is readily available. For those of you who are parents, I always mention, and I'm referring to the signs here. I'm a big fan of looking at historical markers as well, because there's a lot of information about all communities that you can find on them. So this one is located, I want to say maybe out on Highway 96. Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark. Make sure you make a note if you're not familiar with her work. But Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, she was the first Black woman PhD from Columbia University. She was the second Black person. Her husband was actually the first Black person to graduate from Columbia. But she founded she recognized that there wasn't adequate medical care in Harlem, particularly for children. So she and her husband founded the first family mental health agency. They also developed the Clark-Doll test. If you're not familiar with that, look it up. The Clark-Doll test was a test that was done, and they recognized the effects of segregation, particularly on children and feelings of inferiority. And so they had a test where they had children look at a Black doll and a white doll, and they asked them, and you may have seen this on the news too, ABC did something on it, but they looked at both and they said, all right, well, which one is the bad doll? And the doll, the kids would, in the majority of 66% of the kids said the Black doll was the bad doll. And then also there were like 33% of the kids, they asked, well, which doll are you? And the 33% of the little Black kids said that they were the white doll. And so the attorneys who argued Brown versus Board of Education, which was in segregation in 1954, those attorneys reached out to Dr. Clark and her husband, and they actually testified as to the detrimental effects of segregation. And those studies and that information and diagnosis and research made its way into the 1954 case. Other names that you'll find: Solomon Carla Fuller, Dr. James P. Comer, Pearl Bertal Connolly, as well as Dr. Jocelyn Elders as well, all pioneers in the community. Obviously, I don't have enough time to delve into and to go into each one. But one thing I do want to end on is I want to talk about the importance of this National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And Mental Health Awareness Month is celebrated in July. And the origins actually of that month, and that now most recently is referred to as the Black, Indigenous, and People of Colors Mental Health Month. But the origins was B.B. Moore Campbell. Some of you all might have read books about that she's written, and a famous novelist who passed away in the early 2000s. But she was an American author, and she advocated for mental health awareness. She dedicated her life to it, representing underrepresented communities. It was unfortunate she passed away. But in 2008, the United States Congress actually passed a law that created the Minority Mental Health, now known as the BIPOC Mental Health Month. And one of the stories about it is that her daughter actually suffered from mental illness as well, which drove a lot of it. And if those of you all who used to watch the show, what was the show with LL Cool J? I forget it. I had it earlier. I just got too much on my mind. But her name is Maya Campbell, and publicly, even in the past, in the House, thank you, Monet, but publicly over the course of the past 10, 12 years, Maya has struggled with mental illness as well, continued. So, prayers up for her. But who is B.B. Moore Campbell? A quote that stands out, and this, Dr. Branch, you still hear this kind of connects, and Debbie Allen. Thank you, Melissa. But it says, people of color, particularly African Americans, we feel the stigma more keenly. In a race-conscious society, some don't want to be perceived as having yet another deficit. And we carry that around. Dr. W.B. Du Bois talked about this idea of double consciousness, that we exist in two worlds, that people of Africa, black people or people of African descent are constantly aware of who they are in the American story. And as a child, that's what drove me to delve into history is that, during Black History Month, I would always hear stories about Martin Luther King and, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, but I never heard about people who were in my backyard. And I gave a talk that both Monet and Terrell joined me at, where we kind of delve into and we talked about these things, but there's nothing more empowering than understanding who you are and whose you are and where you descend from. And unfortunately, those things were taken away. And so we reach and we're constantly trying to gain more information about it. But while we're doing that searching, we want to not give the appearance of being vulnerable. And particularly as Black men, as Dr. Branch mentioned, we face these things, and a lot of times we're unwilling to move past these stigmas. So just to end, let's be mindful of that, and let's continue this great work.